As we begin our last panel, on behalf of the Center for the Political Future at USC Dornsife and the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival, I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and I want to thank our panelists. So far, it's been terrific, and this last panel promises to be really good. We're missing one of our participants, and that's Ron Klain. Something happened along the way just before he could do this panel. I'm very pleased to be introducing Gloria Borger, who's an old friend of mine and one of the great political journalists in the country. She's CNN's chief political analyst. She appears regularly across all the network's primetime programs. She plays an instrumental role in the network's daily coverage while reporting on a whole range of breaking news stories: the midterm elections, the presidential elections, major Supreme Court rulings, congressional investigations. During the 2020 cycle, as in cycles past, she's played a key role in CNN's special coverage surrounding the conventions and election night. She also hosted the CNN documentary Fight for the White House, Joe Biden's Long Journey, where she interviewed the president-elect and took a closer look at his nearly 5 decades in public service. So Gloria, I am delighted that you are here. I'm delighted all the rest of you are here. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Bob. And I have to say, everything that I know about politics, I've learned at the knee of Bob Shrum. Bob Shrum taught me so much when I started out in politics, and I recommend his book, No Excuses, for everyone to read. So let me start with thanking Bob. Let me introduce our panel today, which I think will be fascinating for everyone. Karen Finney, all these people, old friends. Karen Finney, of course, a Democratic consultant. She's also a colleague of mine, a CNN political commentator. She was senior advisor and spokesperson for Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign in 2018. She was the senior advisor to Stacey Abrams' gubernatorial campaign and the DNC. And we were in constant contact in all of those roles, if I recall. Yes. Steve McMahon, somebody else I've always relied on, co-founder and CEO of Purple Strategies. He served in senior roles in 3 presidential campaigns and produced the advertising in support of then Senator Barack Obama for the DNC and the DNC in the 2008 presidential campaign. And he has a long time experience in working on dozens of Senate, gubernatorial, mayoral campaigns across the country. And he's appeared regularly on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News. Neera Tanden, somebody else who knows so much about Democratic politics and appears regularly on my network. She's the president and CEO of the Center for American Progress and the CEO of the Center for American Progress Action Fund. She served in both the Obama and Clinton administrations, as well as presidential campaigns. And she previously served as a senior advisor for health reform at the U.S. Department of HHS. And let me then get to Richard North Patterson, of whom I am a great admirer. He is a lawyer, political commentator, best-selling novelist, former chairman of Common Cause, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So I am really thrilled to be here moderating this panel. And the name of this panel, I think, is the future of the Democratic Party and the agenda ahead. So we always seem to be talking about the future of the Democratic Party, even when the Democrats win the presidential race. But before we get to the question of how Joe Biden will govern, I think there's a question we ought to start about, and it's sort of the elephant in the room, which is the fact that the Democratic losses in the House, which no one predicted, will leave Nancy Pelosi probably with a 1-seat majority in the House, and the Senate now hangs in the balance with those 2 Georgia runoffs coming up in early January. So since this is about the future and not the past, let's talk about how this new political equation on the Hill is really going to affect what Joe Biden and Kamala Harris can and cannot do. Do they have to lower their sights a little bit? In other words, how does Joe Biden have to govern? And let me start with you, Neera.
So, I mean, obviously a lot rides on the Senate races in Georgia for the equation, but I I think the central question really is, and we're sort of seeing it in real time, which is, Joe Biden's ability to pass legislation, to do things, do any things really, kind of depends on how Republicans in the Senate orient themselves, which is, do they, and I think a lot of that really sort of depends on what Donald Trump decides to do. I mean, I think what happened in this election, I don't want to look back, this is really about looking forward, but you had Donald Trump did mobilize a lot of voters to come out. They came out for him. These are people who haven't come out in previous presidential elections. That's how he won more votes than anyone else. The only person who's ever beat him and the number of votes he won is Joe Biden, who just put together a larger coalition. I think a big question going forward is whether Senate Republicans, either Senate Republicans or there is a possibility of a gang of 6 or a gang of 8. There's Senate Republicans could orient themselves to try and pass, agree in some places, disagree in others. Or you could see, and you sort of saw it this week, where there are a few senators who came out, ahead of the rest of the party in acknowledging Joe Biden's victory. Mitt Romney, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Toomey, and whether you could have some reasonable coalition that wants to pass legislation. Now, it's not likely to pass everything that Joe Biden campaigned on, but you could pass, I think there's actually a coalition for a $15 minimum wage, given Republican support amongst white non-college voters, and whether you could have a big investment in transportation that also addresses climate. And then obviously the central question before us is the coronavirus package. And I'd say just one thing, which is the one asset Joe Biden has going into the future in my mind, is that he has the potential of handling this virus much better than it's been handled before. Because honestly, how could it get worse? So he could actually, handle this virus, distribute the vaccine efficiently, effectively, and create a kind of support in the country that many presidents don't have, because they don't have tests like that so early in their administration.
I'd like everyone to sort of chime in here.
So I'll weigh in and say, I agree, or as the kids would say, plus, Mira. So it's just as you
I always feel better when that happens. Karen particularly.
I agree with everything she said. I think there's a couple of other things that I would advise our Democrats to do. First of all, God love a Democrat. We won and we're still the circular firing squad. Really, people, we won.
I know, right?
Let's focus here, right? So let's just start with that. But I think there's a couple of things. Number one, I think Biden and Harris put together a broad coalition, right? They did a very good job. That's how you got to win in Democratic politics these days. Now, with this massive turnout comes massive expectation and an eagerness to move on from Trump, whether Trump wants to realize that or not. And so I think what they've got to do is build a coalition and build a relationship with the outside organizations and engage them in the process of helping to move some of the legislation, some of this agenda forward, right? I mean, it's, Biden and Harris are not going to be able to do it on their own, even if we do win those 2 seats in the Senate. I think there's going to need to be pressure applied from the outside onto members of Congress, and particularly there may be some vulnerable Republican members of the Senate, for example, to focus on, to try to, if you can't get things done in big packages, break them up into smaller packages. I'm thinking of, parts of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which was, that is the #1 issue aside from COVID for, Black Americans and Latino Americans who turned out. So you're going to need to do something very quickly to make people feel like, things are moving. So I think building a coalition and engaging that, I think one of the biggest mistakes made early on in the Obama administration was, Rahm Emanuel's attitude to the left. I think that soured the relationship forever. And then the second piece of it is, I think—
I'll tell Rahm you said that, okay?
Oh, I'm sure he'll know.
I think he knows.
He'll call me and yell at me about it later, but I don't really care. But then the second piece is I think people are really looking for, even if, and I've been part of so many conversations, even if we don't get back those 2 Senate seats, and I think a lot of Democrats are out there trying to make the case to remind people how important that is. Biden and Harris still have to do things boldly, right? There's a lot of feeling of like, look, we don't like everything Trump did, but if it was executive order, he did it. He leveraged what tools he had to get things done the way he wanted to get them done. We obviously play by the rules a little better than he does. But again, I think people are looking for Biden not start sort of backtracking in any way or seem to backtrack because it's going to be harder, but to say, nope, we're going to keep pressing forward boldly. I think just attitudinally, people are looking for that kind of leadership because they're so hungry for change. And so I think that's the second thing that's really important.
Steve, I mean, it seems to me that, you may want some kind of dramatic change, but the Democratic Party itself, and here we go again about the Democratic Party not agreeing on everything. You have this kind of intense split within the House Democratic Caucus, for example. But Steve, do you agree it's got to be quick, dramatic?
Yes, and can I just start with the
Finney?
I just feel like I have to do this.
Yes.
I agree with so much of what both of them said. And I think there are 2 ways to look at this. One way to look at it is the sort of left-right axis. And obviously, Karen's right, there's an enormous energy on the left to do things, big, bold things, because the left just turned out for this guy in a record kind of way. The other way to look at this is sort of inside outside. And by that, I mean, if you start not with a left-right axis, but who's been left out and who's been left behind and who feels like their lives are not getting better and their kids' lives are not going to be as good as theirs are. And Neera mentioned a $15 minimum wage. That's an issue that is left in one sense, but it's very much an inside out kind of an issue, because in Florida, for instance, 60% of voters voted to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. So there is a constituency that maybe sometimes they vote with Donald Trump, maybe sometimes they would vote with Joe Biden. I don't happen to buy this thing about white, non-college educated. I tend to think of it in terms of who's making money and who's not, who can pay their mortgage and who can't, who's got health insurance coverage and who needs it. And Joe Biden, I think, would be really well advised to focus on those people, because many of them might have been Donald Trump voters, but they're Democrats in terms of their economic status. And we need to start talking to them that way and understanding them that way. And there's one other thing that my really dear, dear friend Karen Finney talks about a lot, which is the importance of values and talking about values. And I know she'll come to this later, but listen to her when she says it, because we tend to talk about things in terms of issues, and we would be better to talk about things in terms of values. What are the values that motivate the Democratic Party? Decency and fairness and justice and racial equality. And those are the things that Joe Biden stood for. And, it's not about defund the police or not defund the police as much as it's about how are we going to treat the people who live in our communities every single day? And how do we expect police officers to treat those people every single day, whether they're black or white? And what are we going to do to make sure that happens? And maybe it's defunding the police, but maybe it's training differently. Maybe it's educating them differently. Maybe there are a lot of different solutions. And if we start to talk about the values that drive the party, we're going to attract a lot more voters to our cause, in my opinion.
I don't think Joe Biden would say it was defunding the police, because he made a point of saying it was not about defunding the police during the campaign.
No, I understand that, but there's a label out there. There was a label out there.
Absolutely.
And it did not reflect what it was those people were talking about, or the challenge that those people felt needed to be addressed. The problem is real, for sure, but the labels don't help us solve it.
Mm-hmm.
Can I say one? Oh, I'll come out at the end. Sorry.
Okay. Richard.
One thing that occurs to me is that as bad as this pandemic is for all of us, it is in a sense a unifying opportunity for Democrats, It's an issue that Americans broadly know we have to deal with. It's not simply a public health issue, an economic issue. It's also a social and racial justice issue, which goes to issues of broad concern to Democrats and which tend to be unifying. I think in a way, the fact that he's going to have to lead with COVID is going to at least postpone some of the disunion among the Democratic right and Democratic left. And give them a cause to work on. The other thing that strikes me about this is if we assume gloomily that Georgia will not go entirely our way, then we're dealing with Mitch McConnell. And the question becomes, how you deal with the tension among progressives that we're not getting stuff done and the worry that we're not taking a stand. One thing I think that Biden should do is incorporate progressives very strongly in looking at what the executive order agenda would be in areas where they simply can't make progress. I think that would help sort of keep the whole show on the road as well.
Mira, you want to say something?
Yeah, I don't want to be flip, but I have to say, I think that the right for decades has found sort of mollifying language for policies that I consider kind of terrible, right? So death taxes is actually, hides basically support for a estate tax, which really protects the super rich and uses farmers, et cetera. And I think some of the, I think if we want to be honest about things, because I do think to know where you're going, you have to know what happened to you. I do think that at least in our preliminary data so far, Joe Biden outperformed the congressional Democrats by 2.4%, which in a world where we have very little ticket splitting, that's actually a pretty significant difference. And I think that Trump has a kind of superpower. I mean, he has multiple powers, but one superpower is to define his opponents. It's how he destroyed 15 Republican, or however many there were in the Republican primaries, is what he did to Hillary. And I do think he had some success in using the left against the party in 2020. Now, I think the good news of this is that Joe Biden is actually, like, everyone knows who Joe Biden is. He beat back Trump's effort to define him. He is the one person so far who's gone up against Trump, who was not negatively defined by the end of this process. And so he will be the president. And I hope we actually come up with better expressions for things that we believe in that are actually popular. I think that is kind of a baseline part of politics. But I also think that, there's work to do in the coalition. Like in the election, basically liberals and moderates got together because they wanted to beat Trump. And I also think that that's part of governing. Liberals need moderates to win with gerrymandering, and the Senate structure. Liberals need moderates to also win to take power. And I don't think people have sort of recognized that so much over the last week. Like, moderates need liberals to turn out. Like, this is coalition politics. You need both parts of this party, and neither one can really live without the other, right? So, the whole craziness in the party, which drives, I know, everyone insane right now, is something that, like, adults have to get together and recognize that to govern, you have to actually get to a broad coalition to support Biden and an agenda. And that is the only way we're going to get anything done.
I think adults being the key word there, but
Can I
that sort of leads me, and I think Richard made a good point when he said that COVID, in a way, because you have to deal with COVID as issue number one, COVID in a way may keep the fissures in the Democratic coalition from coming forward too quickly, because everybody knows you have to do something about COVID, but you also have to do something about economic stimulus. And that is also very much on the front burner. And there are lots of people who said you should have done it before the election. You should have made a compromise. You didn't make a compromise. And so I'm wondering what all of you think. And I'll go around, and please feel free to interject with each other and make believe I'm not here. I'll start with you, Karen, about with the economic stimulus plan, what should Joe Biden do? Should he be willing to chop it up? Should he be willing to, and let's say we don't know the results of what's going to happen in the Senate. Okay, but let's assume he doesn't have a majority just for argument's sake.
Right.
What does he do about stimulus?
So I should say, full disclosure, since I work for Stacey, I'm a believer that we're going to win Georgia.
Okay.
We can talk about that later, and not just because of her brilliance, but because actually the way they've moved Georgia to where it is now is 10 years of a lot of very deep work that I think is a blueprint for what our party needs to do. But just speaking specifically to this economic piece, I think he can cut it up. But this goes back to where I was saying, like, you've got to try to engage this broad coalition, as Nero was talking about, of moderates and more liberals, to say, here's the plan. You got to bring people in on what the plan is and get people's buy-in that I'm not doing what I said I was going to do, but here's my reality and here's how I'm going to get it done. And engage people as part of the plan, I think would be a lot more effective than just trying to do it and message about it out, around it. Because I think, again, there's so much anxiety that people have. I mean, I don't think we can fully, we in Washington and, we live lives where we don't have to live with COVID in the day to day the way most people do. And it really struck me in a focus group that we did in South Carolina for Jamie Harrison, when one woman almost broke down and just said, I'm exhausted. It's so much bad news all the time. I can't take it. I literally cannot. So I just think we have to remember the urgency of people's pain around this. And so, yes, I think if you break it up, but you have to message that in a way that people understand that that is not a reason to lose hope, that it's not all going to happen.
How do you do that though? That's, I guess.
Yeah, again, that's why I think engaging the groups. I mean, have a big, broad coalition, engage, NALEO and CAP and Black Lives Matter and all the different organizations that work so hard in this election to say, okay, here's the plan, right? Here's the legislative plan. We're going to move forward with these things, and here's how we're going to do it, and here's what I need you to do to help us move it, right? And I think he's got to do it because of the sense of urgency. And I'll just say one thing, for African Americans, understand that everything is racial right now. Right? I mean, in our lives, that's how we live our life. I mean, race is our healthcare. We're dying in COVID at higher rates because of racial discrimination in healthcare. Economically, the disparities we've talked about, I mean, even if you take COVID out of it. So I think given the way that Black and brown voters really showed up for Joe Biden, he owes a lot, and he certainly acknowledged that in his speech. And so you've got to make sure that as you are moving forward in this economic stimulus, you are doing things that help to bring relief to the people who are in the greatest need, who are hurting, and make it clear how you're going to do that. And again, I think engaging the groups that speak regularly. And I just want to say one thing to that point. I did some polling work for the DCCC and the Congressional Black Caucus. We found a 20% drop in motivation to vote from the top of the ticket to go down ballot. And a big part of that was because people don't actually know, as much as people think they're communicating, a lot of regular Americans have no idea what Congress is really doing all day and who's fighting for what. And what we found was, for example, when we talked to them about what was in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, or you talk about some of the things in the COVID stimulus plan, they loved it. They thought it was great. It was getting them to realize that's what Democrats were fighting for. So I also think Biden has to recognize that the party has a little bit of a structural problem, and making sure that in the way you do a political campaign, you've got to reach people where they are so that they actually know what you're doing and have that information. I think that, selling it, I think, is something we don't always think about as part of getting the work done.
Are you talking about unemployment benefits? I mean, specifically, I guess.
Sure.
I'm going to.
Yes. So if you do unemployment benefits, if you do continuing forms of, paid leave for people, if you do housing assistance, obviously that's a huge cliff that a lot of people are falling off of right now. I mean, I think if you take again, some of the most urgent needs, maybe you start there and then try to work your way from there, but show that you're starting with the most vulnerable and make it politically also a lot more challenging for the Republicans to deny it.
I tell you what.
Go ahead, Steve.
No, I was just going to say this goes back to the values thing that Karen talks about so much, and Karen, you're my hero when you do this, because I think you're absolutely right. if you start with a fundamental value that most people, Democrats and Republicans, certainly Democrats and Christians would agree on, and that is people shouldn't go hungry and starve to death. People shouldn't lose their homes because they get sick. And if we just started with, we're going to feed people and we're going to keep them from being thrown out of their homes because they've lost their jobs because of an illness that they have no control over. If we started there and we said, we can fight about the post office later, we can argue about how much money state and local governments get later. We're going to start right now by doing what's in our hearts and what Americans ought to be able to agree on, which is we're going to keep people from going hungry and we're going to keep them from living on the streets. Can we just do that? And I just think, you put it to them and you make them vote on it. Now, Nancy Pelosi might not like it because she's done a great job of holding out for a bigger bill. And I actually think she's beaten the Republicans on the politics of it in the short term. But we're getting to the point now where we're getting, winter is coming, people are starving, people are cold, and they're going to start getting thrown out of their homes. And if that means that Democrats have to compromise on this and get to something that we can pass to help people right now, I just think we have to do it and fight later. That's my own view.
I mean, I think this is a discussion that's being had in the Democratic Party, right, Mira? That, the question is, Joe Biden is known as somebody who reaches across the aisle and he knows how to cut a deal. And there are those who feel that, well, we worked our hearts out for him and we don't want to cut deals with Republicans and we don't want to take half a loaf.
Yeah, I guess my take on this is, the most important thing for the Democratic Party going into Georgia, going into the midterms in 2022, is for Joe Biden to maintain like a basic positive approval rating with the country and look like he's doing things to solve people's problems. So I'm not really sure everyone in America kind of gets the nuance of where the agreements are, disagreements. I totally agree with everything that's been said here. I think it's really important to think through what you do in this package to stave off a kind of deep recession, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are the things, and, whether people understand that as fiscal relief or food stamps or housing. I think the truth is that they should negotiate a package and try and get as much as they possibly can. The Republicans did support $1 trillion. So if we got $1.5 trillion at this point, that is like an important thing that we should try to do. But I guess my take on this is a little bit like, it's really important to try and fix people's problems. I think Joe Biden won because people believe that he was actually not hyper-focused on politics and he wasn't going to publish red states and he thinks we're all Americans and he's going to have to, at least always try. And I say to my progressive friends who are anxious about like negotiating with Republicans, which is, at the end of the day, if you're in public office, your job is to solve people's problems. And we're in the middle of a pandemic and a lot of people have a lot of problems. So we're going to have to, no one in Washington is going to get whatever they want. And this, I just hate to break it to everybody, but even if you have a 50 Senate, like, let's be honest, Democrats win Georgia, and I am a big believer in Stacey Abrams and Karen Finney, so I am very optimistic about winning Georgia. But even then, like, the Democratic majority in the Senate rests on states like West Virginia. That's not. We're not just going to get everyone to agree on everything. And so, I think people should be prepared for some degree of compromise on some issues. But really, as Democrats, we believe, or, I also won't speak for it, we have to believe that we're here to serve and make things better for people. And we are in a global pandemic. And, it's very basic that we should be about solving problems. We have to compromise at $1.5 trillion or $1 trillion instead of $3 trillion. $1.5 trillion is $1.5 trillion.
Right.
One thing that strikes me about this, all the contention, I think it's fine to say you couldn't have won without me. And there are lots of members of the Democratic coalition who can say that. It's terrible to say you only won because of me. And I think what we really have to look at here is that the vast bulk of the American public may not be terribly engaged with the policy details, but they are certainly disgusted with gridlock and a failure to achieve things which are fundamental to their welfare. So if Democrats are perceived as holding out or playing games or trying to score political points in the middle of a pandemic, that strikes me as a terrible problem, all of which argues for, I think, what Neera is saying, take the maximum. I think there will be some give on COVID because it's so urgent, and do what you can. But for God's sakes, don't get boxed in to an extreme position which may satisfy one group of your coalition, but won't really satisfy the purpose of governance, which is to serve the broadest number of people in times of great need.
If I were, I'm,
Go ahead,
Good.
Steve.
if I were advising President Biden on January 20th at 12:15, I would say you should go take the oath of office. You should give a short speech, and you should tell Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi that you'll see them in your office, even though it won't have furniture and it's going to be empty, at 12:30, because you're going to sit down with them on day one, and no one's going to leave the Oval Office that day until there's a COVID relief package. And if Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi and they can get it done before then, that's even better. But if they can't, we're going to sit down January 20th. We're not going to have a bunch of parties. We're going to get some work done for the American people. Mitch, I'll see you there. Nancy, I expect you to be there. Bring your pen, bring your pencil, and we're going to stay as long as it takes. And do something. And you know what? If you create that expectation, I mean, of course, the risk is that they won't show up or they wouldn't do it. But I think that risk is minimal. There's a far greater likelihood that he'll get something done day one that people will understand and respect. And it will be far more people who understand and respect it than voted for Joe Biden.
The risk is that the influence within their respective caucuses isn't as great as they would like it to be, because they have to take it back to their caucus and then all hell can break loose.
Right,
And,
but if you
McConnell-
talk about setting an agenda and setting a path and establishing leadership,
Mhm.
I would actually take that risk, because I think, you know, the greater risk is that you lose control of everything on day two without being able to get anything you want done.
Well, that's what my next question for all of you guys, which is Joe Biden comes in with a lot of goodwill from 78 million people. And the question is, how does he use it up front? Is it the way Steve is talking about? Does he come in, say, sit down with me, we're going to do this COVID relief, we're going to do stimulus and executive orders, undoing everything or a lot of things that Donald Trump did, and then angering the 71 million people who voted for Donald Trump? So, you know, Joe Biden's not a fan of executive orders. He has said that in the past, but I think he's changed his mind on it pretty quickly now. So the question is, how do you do that and say to people, I represent all of you, but then I'm going to undo what your guy did on day one?
So I'm just going to go to that, though. I want to just go back to this sort of structural point that I'm making, because I would do the Steve thing. That's fine. And the simple answer to your question, Gloria, is leverage that power. Do not waste it. I mean, you know, I was at the DNC when Obama, during the Dean years and when Obama first came in, and there was so much anxiety, remember, among Democrats and Republicans on the Hill. He has this massive email list. Oh my God, he's going to use it against us. And they didn't. And frankly, if it was me, I would have. So part of it is use the goodwill and the votes to leverage that power, but not just in the politics of how you do Washington, but at the grassroots of how you sell what you are trying to do, and go and use values-based messaging. Because I think, going back to my point about this, what we saw in some of the polling around congressional races, you know, people don't follow the machinations back and forth. What they'll know about a meeting was, okay, I think the president sat down with a Pelosi and McConnell. Did anything happen? No, you want to make sure that you're communicating. I'm going to sit down with these guys. Here's what here's my values. Here's what we're fighting for. And that's why I say, I think engaging this coalition that supported you and engaging the grassroots so that you have a bigger force. That's something that Trump did very effectively. people are so terrified of him on his 87 million Twitter followers. And I read somewhere that it's something like he tweets about 1,000 times a week and each tweet gets like 17,000 retweets. I mean, so just think order of magnitude, the kind of, right? If you're Joe Biden and you have something along those lines in terms of how many people voted for you and your political power, use it in that way. Use it for good in the way that Trump used his for what I would consider evil, in terms of applying political pressure, so that, you know, this point about Mitch McConnell goes back to his caucus, and what pressure are you applying to certain members of his caucus to make sure that he won't go weak-kneed? What pressure are you applying to some of the Democrats, both in the Senate? I mean, you know, to Neera's point, certainly in the Senate, there's going to be a real diversity there of Democrats. So being strategic about how you apply political pressure, but also using that grassroots structure. And one of the things I think as a party we don't do, we lost, and I'll do a little Howard Dean 50-state strategy here, is our ability to talk to voters on a regular basis about who we are and what we stand for. And, you know, I have looked at Stacey Abrams' plan from 2011, when she said by 2020, we will be a battleground state. Among the strategies, stop trying to get back white men that aren't going to vote for us. How about all these millions of women in Georgia who want to lean our way, and Black voters and Latino voters? But also, let's have unrelenting, clear communications with people so they know what we're doing for them. I think too often we don't, that is values-based messaging. So making it clear to people, I'm out here fighting for you, here's how I need your help. I think people in this moment, this is the last thing I'll say, want to be called to do something. We voted, now let us do something to help make it happen.
So in terms of executive orders, listen, you know, that's clear messaging. You're signing a document and you're saying, I'm making the world safe for I'm making the United States safe for dreamers. And
Yes.
You're doing that, you know, in a minute. Is that, but again, you're going to do that. You might anger a bunch of people, and Biden comes in saying, I want to represent everybody. I mean, would you guys recommend, and Steve, you're our, you know, if he were your client, let's say this, he's your political client, and you've already said, okay, call in Nancy Pelosi. And on day one, he's talked about climate change, rejoining the Paris Accord, right? Executive action on that. What else? That would not then be divisive, or doesn't it not?
You know, some of it will be divisive, but there are things that he promised during the campaign that he would do by executive order on day one that I think he should do. I don't think those things were particularly divisive or controversial. They were just things that a Democrat would do that you would naturally expect a Democrat to do. But I do think he's got to do some things that are going to require legislative victories. And I think he's going to have to be bold to set both an example and an agenda that we're going to try to get some things done here. And if it requires shaming and embarrassing Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi, and I don't think it's shameful or embarrassing to sit down and cut a deal and get some relief for people who are going hungry and losing their homes. But if it requires a little theater to get that done, I think you just get it done. You know, as Neera has pointed out, you already have, you know, the Republicans have already said they'll go to 1.2 or 1.5 or something. And I think the Democrats have said they'll come down to 1.8. So what's the problem here? Let's get it done. And I actually think if he says, you know, we're going to do this on January 20th, and we follow Karen's strategy, which is to communicate it, to bring the groups in, to talk about the values that require us to get this done. Yes, with Republicans, if that's what it takes in a democracy and a government where we don't control everything. If that's what it takes, we're going to do it. And we would encourage everybody who thinks this is important, whether you voted for Joe Biden or Donald Trump, to call your elected officials and tell them it's important. Tell them to get on board. I mean, these are the things that a president can do that, frankly, I agree with Karen. I'm surprised more presidents don't do it. And it's not just their email list and their ability to send out a tweet. It's their ability to stand in front of a camera and say, call your elected member of Congress today. Here's a phone number.
You know, that's sort of Back to the Future. I remember politicians used to do that. Yeah. Well, let me ask you, Richard, does Joe Biden has goodwill? He's got a Democratic Party that may go along with him at the beginning and may peel off eventually. He's got Republicans who are going to be recalcitrant for their own political futures. You've got Donald Trump out there. Who knows if he's running in 2024 or what kind of a factor he's going to be. So, and we know how Biden dealt with his colleagues in the past, which was to walk across the aisle. And people now say, well, don't be naive. That just can't happen anymore. We live in a different environment. And what say you on all of this?
Well, I think he has to start with issues that have broad appeal and see what McConnell is up for. And setting aside COVID, which we all agree is job one, there's what you do about healthcare and a public option, for example. There's what you do about infrastructure, which also might create green jobs. I mean, we've had infrastructure week every week for 4 years and nothing has happened. I think there's some pent-up demand in that area. The $15 minimum wage, obviously, is mentioned, could have broad support. So I think you do those things and you do your damnedest to get something meaningful before you start going to war on executive orders and tendentious issues. I will say the other thing that he can do to keep his progressives on board. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about who's going to be in this cabinet. And I think you look at some cabinet departments which are particularly meaningful to progressives, whether it's HHS or EPA or HUD or labor, and certainly having a progressive-minded attorney general who is concerned with issues of racial equity and restoring Justice Department oversight of police practices. All those things will be an early method of keeping progressives on board while Biden does the slog of trying to get stuff done with McConnell in popular area. I certainly think you put the minimum wage and healthcare and infrastructure ahead of the Green New Deal kinds of things, because you're dealing with those matters which are most urgent to people. Another thing would be some sort of debt relief or some sort of a liberalization of the standards for free community college and things like that.
Yeah,
one of
I
the
think
things that progressives have talked, one of the things that I've heard people talk about that I think would be, I mean, obviously COVID and the economy are very pressing, and healthcare could end up being very pressing. HR 1, particularly if you have, which was the package that was passed in the House that has voting rights, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We just had an election with historic turnout. Let's make it easier for people to vote going forward. I mean, there are a number of parts in HR 1 around transparency, around anti-corruption, that I think that would send a signal, because a lot of the progressive groups have invested a lot of time and energy into supporting HR 1. So that's kind of what I mean, in addition to, what Neera is talking about in terms of, I'm not a numbers girl, right? So, well, let her negotiate the economic package. But you could also press for some things, or be seen to be pressing for something that is very important to the progressive world, but frankly, that should be American values. Voting. We all just came around the issue that voting is important. Can we not agree on that? I mean, there's certain parts, I think, in HR 1 that, again, from a values frame, you could sell and really press, and it would be meaningful to people to see him come out and trying to support moving that forward, particularly if we did get 50 votes in the Senate. So I think looking for something like that, where it is, as I say, it's something people have been working on, it's meaningful, they care about it, it's not, not too many radical ideas. The second thing very quickly that I'll say would be, if I were advising, a strategy that I might also, they are about to discover how much rot and decay there really is in the agencies. Like, we don't even know. We know a little, we don't even know how bad it is, right? We know anecdotally. So I would also make a strategy of announcing all the bad that you're finding and having to fix, because you got to get some credit for the fact that, unfortunately, we're going to have to go forward a little bit. And you got to bring people into that reality. It's not like January 21st, boom, fresh slate, we're just going to, roll with it. We know even this transition period is going to be a little bit murky. And so I would make a strategy of saying, like, oh my God, you guys won't believe what he did to pattern and practice investigations at the FBI. We're going to restore that right now.
So would you establish sort of this is a great idea. I think you've got like a commission to say, we're gonna make sure that what he did, you can't do again.
Mhm.
What he did to distort government and the operations of government,
That's right.
you cannot do again. Is there a way to get Congress involved in that, or can a president just do that by executive order and say, this is not allowed? You know, we had the Watergate reforms after Watergate. Is there a way to
Well, yeah, he
legislate?
could actually just be not corrupt. That's the
Well,
executive action way to do it.
That's boring, Nira.
I mean, which I think he's planning to do, which I think is a good thing. But like
Right.
Schiff outlined a series of, there's HR 1, and then in the fall, Chairman Schiff and a number of the chairs of the committee, relevant committees, judiciary and oversight, as well as Intel, announced a series of proposals which do take legislation to, you know, like a perfect example is to put teeth behind the Hatch Act. So, you know, president couldn't just violate that and create a lot more, you know, basically legalize some of the norms that Trump broke. But so that's totally possible.
That would have a lot of bang, because you could go through it piece by piece and say,
Yeah.
this happened, it can't happen again, this happened again.
I guess I'd like to say, I'm sorry, I just wanted to say something that might be kind of controversial here, which is Joe Biden had a very strong victory. I believe it's a very strong victory, extremely strong victory. I would say, just for context, I'm sure other people handled this, but you know, when we've been looking around the world, you know, we don't have very much, we have very little experience with a kind of right-wing populist, xenophobic populist taking power and then being defeated, right? Sometimes they don't take power. They didn't take power in France. They didn't take power in Germany. But once they take power, whether it's Turkey, Hungary, like transforming the politics of Britain, or India, I mean, there's myriad examples where it's really hard for the center-left coalition liberals to defeat the populists. Why? Because they have incredible control over the media. I'll leave it to that. They break norms. They, you know, lots of things. They use the power of the state to help themselves. So this is a tremendous victory. But I do think we have to say, structurally, the Democratic Party does have some challenges into the future to win the Senate and to have a stronger hold on the House because of gerrymandering and because of the Senate structure. And so I think we have to think a lot more about how Joe Biden is building on his coalition so that in 2022, you can win the Senate seats in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, and because that is what's going to take to, you know, do what we all want to do. There are plenty of states Democrats could lose in 2022. So I am not one of these people. There are a lot of people over the last week who've been like super negative, and you know, the most important thing is defeating Trump, and that's a really important thing to do. But we have to figure out, you know, the Republicans are thinking of a multiracial coalition of working class people, and we should be honest. They brought back some Latino working class people. And they did a little bit better. I mean, I don't think it's like transformative, but a little bit better with African Americans. So, you know, but like if you're in politics, you have to think about where's their coalition and how do you pull some of those people back. And I think we have to do it across everybody. You know, there was some bleeding with Asians, Latinos, and some African Americans. We have to build stronger with that group. But you know what we also have to do as a party? We do have to do better with white non-college voters or white working. I mean, we should all try to do that. And that's why I think, you know, and I don't think it's economic anxiety, right? Because these voters went, that is all a canard, because these voters all thought the economy was fantastic. Okay. Let's just say Trump's base voters, when you poll them, they were not feeling like the economy is terrible. They're arguing they're doing a lot better, but they have believed something about the Democratic Party is against them. And now we have a president who can prove to them he's not against them. And I think we have to push ourselves a little bit across the board to think how we do that. Now, again, I'll say handling the virus well in a way that isn't socialism or all these other things people thought could be an important proof point for government working for you that would help engender support over the long term. But I think all of us need to think a little bit about that. And I don't think you do it at the expense of any part of your coalition. You know, that's the thing about these two coalitions. They're relatively close. We all have to think about expanding them across the board.
But I think,
Steve.
Nira, sorry.
Go ahead, go ahead.
I was just
Karen?
gonna say, I think we have to also acknowledge, if we're gonna, rip the Band-Aid off, Nira, it wasn't economic anxiety, it was racial anxiety. It was anxiety
Yeah,
about gay
absolutely.
people, about Black people. Trump says, those people are taking your jobs, those women have your, your son can't get into college because that woman's got his slot, right? I mean, and this is, one of the things in 2016, right, was we bet on that the demographics of the country had changed enough to build the coalition and win. Donald Trump bet on not so fast, lady, and that there was enough grievance around the changing America that, and he used the dog whistles. And I do think to some degree, what is a positive coming out of 2020, he tried the same thing again. What did he do? He, tried birtherism on Kamala Harris. He called her a monster. He called her a socialist. He, told Black people she's the top cop and they tried everything they could, right, to run the same playbook, and it didn't work as well with enough people. I mean, enough people saw through it so I think to Nira's point in terms of building the coalition, I agree 100%. And I think the Democratic Party makes a mistake a lot of times of thinking, this is another thing I really admire about Stacey Abrams, that, okay, either we're going to talk to white people or we're going to talk to Black people. And that is the mistake. That's why I talk about values-based messaging, because that is a stupid, stupid mistake that we make. I mean, I'll just say it. Stacey Abrams won more votes than any Democrat in the history of Georgia, more white people. A single Black woman with a big gap in her teeth, right, won white people. And she went everywhere throughout the state, even places where she had to be escorted because the Klan was waiting for her to talk to every single voter. So you can't say, I think one of the fallacies and one of the positives of what Biden-Harris did, and that we have to, as a party, embrace as we build our coalition, is we have to build that coalition and not at the expense of one versus the other, which is part of what I find troubling about some of the conversations that have been happening among some of the members of Congress.
Yeah, I think Karen, and I think you're both right. I'm not sure, at least to my way of thinking, I'm not sure that you can unwrap the cause and the effect as neatly as maybe all of us would like to, because there's no question that part of it is racial, but a big part of it also is I'm losing something I used to have. I'm falling farther behind. And so I think what Trump did is he used racist dog whistles to get at so he's blaming the economic anxiety on the Black or the Hispanic or somebody else, or the woman who's taking your place or taking your job or keeping you down. And the worst thing that could ever happen to us as a party, in my opinion, is if we allow the Republicans to divide whites and Blacks, working class whites and Blacks from one another, so that we feel like it's a zero-sum game, because it's not. In fact, working class whites and working class Blacks are going to do better together, not separately, if Democratic policies are enacted. And I want to come back to a second to this notion of, Trump, I think, in my opinion, corrupted the use of the executive order by using it to go around Congress and accomplish things that he couldn't have done otherwise. Now, the Democratic response, and all of us liberals would say, gosh, we should never do that because that's terrible what he did. The other way to do it is to say, we should actually do it, and we should bend government toward the people who need government's help the most. And what if Joe Biden, for instance, signed an executive order and said, if you're a big insurance company, you can't sell health insurance to the federal government or to any federal employee if you don't make an option available at the lowest cost to anybody who wants to buy in, right? It doesn't require Congress, theoretically. Now, I'm sure Nira will tell me why you can't do it. No, I'm serious. I'm sure there's a reason why you can't, because it's so obvious that otherwise we would have done it. But, when I went to work for Bob Schrum a long time ago, I won't say how many years ago, Bob, in Ted Kennedy's office, you got like Blue Cross Blue Shield, 5 options. You want to take the low option, the medium option, the high option. The low option will cost you more than you can afford, Steve, because Bob's not paying you that well. But there's an option that is affordable even to a lowly Senate staffer. I'm sure that if we were thoughtful, we could figure out a way to do something similar without having to get through a Republican Senate on a public option, to get an option of health insurance, affordable health insurance, which we could then supplement in other ways, available to everybody quickly. Nira, why can't we do it? We can't do it, right, Nira?
I mean, I hate to break this to you, Steve, but that's a little bit what's in the ACA. So I feel like that.
Never
I
mind.
mean, we should have better subsidies so that it's more affordable. But that is kind of the theory of the ACA itself.
Did you require in the ACA that if you want to sell to
Read
the
it.
federal government, you have to sell to anybody at that or lower? Maybe you did.
Yeah, we did actually. So
Thank you.
sorry, that's actually
Thank
the
you for doing
bill.
that.
I mean, that just tells you how much more we have to sell the bill 10 years later. But so
Ignore
can
you
I
can
say
get
something kind of pushing back on Steve, which is I saw this poll this week, which is Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, and how on the right track, wrong track on the on right track, wrong track, and their views on the economy. So, like 80% of Republicans thought the economy was great
Yes.
last week. Okay, and now like 20% do. Now Democrats kind of switched a little bit, much less.
Well, Democrats were always more pessimistic about where the economy was throughout the entire
Right,
election.
right. But like the right track, wrong track really was like, you know, I just have to break it to people. Like, I think we have to pass a $15 minimum wage and focus on jobs for people in this pandemic because it's the right thing to do. And also, these people have been told that essentially the Democratic Party hates them and doesn't care what happens to them. And this is like everyone who voted for Trump. And Joe Biden has to demonstrate, I think, to the country, he cares about everybody, not just one group. But I also think it's just wrong that Republicans feel like this economy has been terrible for them, or why, because they actually under Trump believed it's been great. That was why that's one of their big arguments for voting for him, because the economy has been great under him. So, you know, I think we have to just recognize the facts that we're living with. Sorry.
So we have some great questions. I just wanted to say, and I want to start getting to them if you guys don't mind. And I'm gonna, and I think we can all answer this. The first one easily, which is, are any of you at all worried that Trump will be a second-term president? Can Americans 100% count on Biden being our next president? Is Trump really out? Yes, Trump is really.
Yes,
Yes.
1,000%.
Ding dong, the witch is dead.
He's losing. It's over.
Yep.
Yes.
We don't trust Trump, and we want to celebrate our new president. He will be sworn in January 20th. Can I answer that
Yes.
for everybody? Okay,
Yes.
fine.
Yep.
From Michelle Drath, a friend of mine. What will or should be Kamala Harris's contribution to Biden's legislative agenda efforts? And let me start with you, Richard, and then we can noodle that a little bit.
Well, I think one thing that she can do, and she has to do with serving as a liaison to some of the groups we've been talking about, keeping the outside groups on team and engaged. I think she can do that. I think that would be helpful to her within the party. She doesn't have a long legislative background. She's not Joe Biden in that way. Her major profile in the Senate was built upon sort of performative set pieces and hearings where she questioned people, and her prosecutorial chops came to the fore. So I think using her as a liaison to important Democratic groups would be educational for her, helpful to her within the party, and very helpful with those groups, because there's somebody very important next to the president who is paying close attention to them. So I think that would be a great place for her to be.
Anybody else want to add to that before I go on to?
I'll just say briefly, I think Kamala will be a great, I think she'll play, I hope, and I expect that she'll play the same kind of role Vice President Biden did, which is that she will be an advisor across the board, not on particular issues. I think she'll be helpful with the groups, but I would say her role would be a lot more expansive than that. I think her role will be to be the last person in the room the vice president, the president-elect and president talks to when he's making policy decisions. I think she has a wealth of experiences as Attorney General. She'll obviously play a role on issues related to the Department of Justice, but I expect her to have a really broad portfolio.
Here's a question that maybe Steve would want to handle, which is, or Karen, from from Howard Daniels. Do the Democrats need a more centralized election strategy? For instance, wasn't it a waste of $100 million to go after Lindsey Graham?
No, I'll just start because I work with Jamie Harrison. Hell no. I don't know if I can say the H word on Zoom, but I'll say it. No, look, I mean, couple of things, right? I mean, number one, let's think about the fact that, and this is where I think Democrats do not take the long view enough. And again, I go back to Georgia, and I'll talk about in the context of South Carolina. The state of South Carolina and the electorate is forever changed by Jamie Harrison having run. And so if a Democrat wants to run statewide the next time, it will be easier, right? For all of the boring, voter file, voter lists, building capacity inside the state in terms of people who know how to win races, all of that. But also, and again, the number of votes that he actually got and having an infrastructure that to then build on top of. So, and look, it was a hard thing to do. It was a young Black man going up against an older white established white man. Let's just be honest. That is always, when you're the challenger, that is always hard. But just because something is hard to do does not mean it is not worthy to do. And so this is one of the things I think our party has to do. I don't know what the person means in terms of a centralized strategy, but I would offer that I think we need more of a strategy that takes the sort of 50-state strategy blueprint and says, we can win anywhere if we build a strategy and have the patience to implement that strategy and show up and talk to people about who we are and what we stand for. Very quickly, did a post-election project in Milwaukee. Young African-American voters, they voted for Obama, they didn't vote for Hillary. What did they say when we asked them why? Nobody asked me for my vote. Just because you brought, Beyonce and Jay-Z, we saw that concert in Philly, what? But you didn't ask me, nobody contacted me to vote for her or to make their case. So I think versus I think the Biden campaign did a good job of reaching out to Black voters this time and didn't take people for granted. So no, it was not a waste of money. It was a lot of money, but I think it was ultimately worth it.
Can I say one brief word about this? Just really, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So I was just wondering if you had anything to say on that, then sure.
Mira, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I'll just say something really briefly. I think we have to learn a lot about what happened in the election. I'm really interested in what happened with Latinos in different areas. It does seem in the cities, Latinos did kind of surge as much as everyone else in cities did, but in particular, in a lot of areas like the Rio Grande is a really big question of how Trump did so much better in the Rio Grande when Latino voters, this connects directly to something Karen said. Latino voters in Arizona and Nevada seem to actually, their numbers were basically aligned with the national numbers, which was, pretty overwhelming majority for Biden. And I think one thing we have to think about is in Nevada, Latinos have been organized by unions. In Arizona, the immigrant rights groups have been organizing against Arpaio for years. And so those people are mobilized. And this really goes to something Karen said, which is, I think we have to continually mobilize in place or continually engage voters and have an infrastructure. With the decline of unions and the decline of other organizations, we really need to have a consistent engagement. That is exactly what Stacey has done over 10 years, is build an infrastructure in which voters are hearing from the party or progressive groups or an organization year in and year out. And you make the simple case of how your vote translates into policy change that then affects your life, which is an ongoing conversation, particularly when there's so much distrust. So, there's been a lot of back and forth in the party, but if we could all agree on that one thing, I think it would be really helpful. Sorry.
Yeah. No. Karen and I worked for Howard Dean, and Howard Dean's view was you have to show up everywhere in every election. And the best proof that showing up everywhere makes a difference is, frankly, Georgia and Arizona and Texas, 2 states that flipped this year. 2 out of those 3 flipped this year because Democrats showed up every year in and year out, and lost a lot of races before they started to win and before they turned to red state blue. And Texas is headed that way. And, Nira's right. We have to do a much better job of understanding the Latino voter. Obviously, the Puerto Rican voter is different than the voter who comes from Cuba, who comes from South America or from Mexico, and they voted differently. And you could see that in Dade County, you could see it in the Rio Grande, and you could see how it was different in California and in Arizona and some of the states out west. Frankly, some of the states where immigrants were greeted with Prop 187 or with the stop and ask for the ID law. And that wasn't the case in Texas or in Florida when some of those folks came. So we have to really, as a party, stop treating the Latino vote as a monolithic one and stop believing that we can speak to every one of those different groups of Latinos in the same way. But I actually think we're starting to recognize that and deal with it. And I think it's going to be better 2 years from now and even better 4 years from now when we have another presidential election, because we may be late to the game in terms of understanding all that, but once we're on it, we'll figure it out.
And let me put this question. This is a really good question up to Richard from Ibrahim Ahmed. What can the Democratic Party do to address their economic messaging problem? As mentioned, Floridians overwhelmingly supported their state proposition to increase the minimum wage, but exit polls showed that they trusted Trump over Biden on the economy, even though Trump is against raising the minimum wage. I think he did say he was for raising the minimum wage during the campaign at some point. He has gone back and forth on that, but let's just say it wasn't a key part of his economic platform, but he has said, I wouldn't be against it. But in any case, the larger point is the Democrats' economic messaging issue problem.
Well, I actually think that between the progressives and the moderates, that Biden reached a pretty progressive, strong economic program. He may not have gone for free college for everyone, but he was going to make it affordable for a lot of people. He's going to relieve student debt. He was going to reinforce and augment the rights of labor unions, which is very important. He was going to do serious infrastructure spending. He linked his climate change program to the creation of green jobs. And I think it's almost pointless to set aside the sort of the myth built upon, the art of the deal that Trump is an economic genius and just focus on what Biden can do. The nuts and bolts of his message, which I think was a very, very strong message. He won't be able to do all those things, but if we're out there advocating for them quite clearly, then I think that'll make a difference with people who are persuaded by an economic message. The other thing is, you talk about the Hispanic vote. I gathered that there was considerable appeal in the notion that the Republicans were in favor of building up small businesses and entrepreneurship. I don't think there's any reason why the Democrats can't take on that message and add that to their agenda. So I think we have a real opportunity here among Democrats to run strong on economic issues. Because if you look at what the Republicans have really done in terms of being proactive and using government as a force for good and raising the opportunities of ordinary Americans, they haven't done a whole hell of a lot. And I think Democrats really do have an opening there.
The economy, of course, as we all know, was Donald Trump's strongest suit as he ran for re-election. And Joe Biden managed the economic recovery plan for Barack Obama in his first term. And that was largely thought to be a success and did not pass with a lot of Republican support at all. So, perhaps the managing the economy would be helped if Biden gets a COVID plan, because that is going to control the economy. To me.
I think this is people. I have to say respectfully, I think people think of these issues as like policy issues, and this is really just much more about Trump's handling of the economy and cheerleading the economy and people thinking the economy was pretty good. And I think the truth of this is really, and the most important thing for Joe Biden is actually handling the virus well, containing the virus, handling the virus, distributing the vaccine efficiently and effectively so the economy can reopen. And once that happens, he'll experience like 10%, 12%, 15% growth because the virus is holding us back. So I really think, like, if I were advising Joe Biden, what I would say is your job is to make sure this economy works and grows, because people aren't evaluating policy here. They're just looking at results and thinking that's like the proof point.
But can I just say near to that point, what I think Trump understood, or somebody around Trump understood, was there's another piece to, I mean, yeah, we want to have money in our pocket, but there's aspiration to that. You want to be able to send your kids to college. You want to be able, right? And it's speaking to the aspirational piece that I think is also important when people talk about, like, at least with, certainly with Black voters that I've talked to, you know, in polling, it's like, I just don't want to be struggling all the time. We want to be doing a little better. We, you know, I want to do a little better. And then, and also for a lot of families, think about it. If you, I mean, in many generations, like people my age are the first generation in communities of color where your parents were able to pass a little bit of something on to you. I mean, think about how powerful that is. I mean, that's why this conversation about wealth creation, it's not that everybody's going to be a millionaire, but it's understanding. I mean, it's sort of interesting because when you talk to voters about it, right, and they're like the stock market, and you're like, well, what's your portfolio? Oh, I don't have one of those, but I know it's good when the stock market's good. But there's an aspiration that Trump sold, you know, around the art of the deal, which we all know is a sham, and the TV show that people bought into, that I think, yes, if people have more money in their pockets, they're going to feel better. But I also think, again, going back to how you grow a coalition around that is to also speak to the aspirational. We all, you know, we would that we could all be millionaires, right? We all would love to try and feel like we have the opportunity.
We have time for one more question, and so I'm gonna read it, and I'm gonna add to it from Avi Poster, who said, "Who do you think will likely be part of Joe Biden's cabinet?" He said he loved Cory Booker for HUD, but we need him in the Senate. My question to all of you is, will Bernie Sanders be the Secretary of Labor, and would that be a smart thing? He has said that he would like that job. And do you think Biden? How do you think Biden is thinking about his cabinet, and would Bernie likely be a part of it?
I think it's really hard to take anybody out of the Senate with it this close. Unfortunately, I mean, I just think that's a practical.
Sadly, who has been appointed, but who would, when a Republican governor would appoint.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right. So forget Bernie Sanders. But what kind of?
I mean, that's a challenge for Sanders and Warren, sadly.
Yeah.
And so what kind of? So if Sanders is out and then Warren is out, because she's been considered as a potential Treasury Secretary, for example, how do you see this cabinet shaping up? Looks like America. Diverse,
yes.
Republican, Democrat. Why don't we just go around the screen? I guess you call it, Steve.
I think it will be the most diverse cabinet in history. I think there'll be more women than in a cabinet. I think it will not include Republicans, and I don't think he has any need to include Republicans at this point. And I think it's going to be great.
You don't think it will, Mira?
Oh, I have the opposite. I think it'll be very diverse, and I think he will represent his coalition. So I think he will have a Republican in his cabinet. I mean, that's my expectation. I think he'll have someone from, you know, one or two people, maybe more from the left. They just won't be senators, but there'll be other people.
Nira, who do you think the likely Republicans would be? Like a Kasich or?
Kasich, yeah.
Kasich. I mean, Kasich at transportation, like, I mean, or I don't know, there's a Flake you could do. I mean, there are a number of them, but like that was an important message to moderate voters. I mean, I just think like it was an important message that never Trumpers. Anyway.
Karen?
I hope it's a Black person in charge of the Treasury, because that is so against type. And I would love to see, you know, in the way that Ernie Moniz in the Obama administration, I was going to call it the O'Biden administration.
That was Sarah Palin who called him O'Biden.
Exactly. Was an actual Nobel laureate, right? I mean, how about let's go outside the box to academia or to people who are practitioners and some of the other agencies as we think about whether it's education or HUD, like people who have real skin in the game and real mud on their shoes in terms of their work. So thinking a little bit outside of the political box.
Richard?
My feeling is that when we're talking about the cabinet, the Attorney General's office is so key. And I think it would be important to have a person of color with a strong background in criminal justice and criminal justice reform. I think that's a matter of great practical importance. I also think it's a matter of considerable symbolic importance. And so I keep coming back to that one when I think about the cabinet.
Well, it's going to be interesting. I mean, Joe Biden has said his staff today said he's going to be extremely deliberative, which we know that Joe Biden is. He likes to take his time making decisions. So I don't
Yes,
know.
he does.
I interviewed Biden for my plug. My documentary is running again on Biden Saturday night at 10 o'clock. When I was
It was
interviewing,
excellent.
thank you. When I was interviewing him for it, and he was in the middle of deciding, and he said, you know, I like to take my time with these things, and he needs to feel comfortable with things. And so I don't know that we'll have anything before Thanksgiving, although they say maybe one or two. So we should all sort of hang in there and see who he's going to appoint, but don't worry the person who asked that question about whether he will be president. The answer is he's president-elect.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I want to thank
Damn
all.
straight.
Yep, I want to thank all of you for this discussion. It's been great. One day we can all see each other in person and have a cup of coffee. And thank you, USC and Bob Schrum and everybody else for hosting this for us. And I enjoyed the discussion, and I hope you guys all did too. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to so many of your questions. Next time we'll try and do that. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.